In the spring of 1945, the sea around Okinawa burned with the light of armadas. More than 1,500 ships lay upon the Pacific swells, their silhouettes jagged against the pale horizon, their hulls trembling with engines tuned for invasion. The island itself waited fortified, buried, half-starved, its limestone ridges honeycombed by soldiers who had sworn never to surrender. Beneath them, in caves and crumbling villages, civilians hid among tatami mats and the scent of kerosene, mothers clutching infants against the tremor of bombardment that did not stop for weeks. The operation was called Iceberg. The planners had expected coral beaches, hard resistance, then victory. What unfolded instead was something older and more elemental, a meeting of worlds, one exhausted and vanishing, the other armed with the precision of industry. The Navy and Marines came ashore on April 1st, Easter Sunday, with the smell of cordite thick in the wind, and the sea behind them still alive with the echoes of their own artillery. The sand of Hagushi Beach turned black with fuel and iron. The corpsmen followed. Young men, barely older than the wounded, they would soon kneel beside, white armbands already smeared with salt. At first there were few civilians. The island seemed emptied by war, its rice paddies cratered and flooded, its tombs cracked open by shells. The corpsmen advanced behind the riflemen, their packs swollen with morphine syrettes, sulphur powder, bandages, and the small silent instruments of their mercy. Above them, aircraft twisted through the low clouds, their propellers scattering the rain into mist. The rain was constant fine, patient, soaking every wound and uniform, turning the ground into a brown anatomy of suffering. For the Okinawans, the war arrived as a tide of foreign faces and thunder. Many did not know which army had come, only that it was endless, and that the sky itself had turned hostile. Mothers carried children into the limestone hills, where the air was heavy with bats and the slow drip of underground streams. There they waited, whispering prayers that had no words for the machines that now owned the daylight. Some carried ancestral tablets wrapped in cloth, others carried nothing but the will to live one more hour. When the corpsmen finally found them, weeks later, when the front lines had shifted southward and the American advance began to move into the maze of civilian hamlets, they appeared not as enemies but as remnants, thin, mud-streaked, terrified. The war had left them without language. Corpsmen offered water, halved their own rations, tore open first-aid tins, meant for Marines, and pressed gauze against wounds they did not understand. It was the first moment when the killing machine hesitated, when the machinery of conquest bent, slightly, toward compassion. But even then, it was never still. The island shook every hour with artillery. From the escarpments came the sound of the Japanese guns high, cracking, irregular, like the coughing of gods. Every night the ships offshore spat tracers into the darkness, and amid it all the corpsmen learned to work by touch, to find the pulse in a throat under candlelight, to measure a man's life against the time it took for another volley to fall. The smell of Okinawa was a mixture of wet grass, ammonium, blood, and camphor. The men wrote home about it, though they could not explain why it stayed with them, even after the sea washed their uniforms clean. It was the smell of something collapsing, of a civilization being unstitched in slow motion. By mid-April, the Japanese defense stiffened around Shuri Castle. The Americans dug in, the Navy's hospital ships overflowed, and the island itself became a single breathing wound. Thousands of Okinawan civilians were caught between the two armies. The corpsmen began to improvise, setting up makeshift aid stations in captured farmhouses, in the ruins of schools, even beneath banyan trees heavy with rain. There was no distinction between military and civilian in the field of pain. There were only bodies and the will to keep them from dying. The Japanese mothers came out at night, guided by whispers, sometimes carrying their children on their backs, sometimes dragging the wounded by ropes. They came barefoot through the mud, silent except for the sobbing of infants too weak to cry. The corpsmen did not know the words to comfort them, but they opened their kits anyway. They worked beneath tarps, their hands trembling from exhaustion and the endless sound of shells. It was there, in those crude clinics lit by flashlights and faith, that the first bridges were built, not in treaties, but in the act of one human being trying to save another. Okinawa would soon become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. But in those early days, before the statistics had meaning, before history wrote its verdict, there was only the storm, the rain, and the small, stubborn light of men who refused to let mercy drown. The island entered May beneath a sky of fire. By then, every ridge south of the Ginowan line had become a fortress. The Japanese 32nd Army dug into caves and tunnels that coiled through the hills like veins, fought with the desperation of those who had already seen the end. For the Americans, the campaign was no longer about territory, but attrition. Each yard of ground had to be purchased in flesh. It rained without mercy. The downpour blurred the lines between mud, blood, and sea. Trenches filled to the brim, corpses floated where water found its lowest point, and through that deluge moved the corpsmen, those young figures in soaked fatigues, their red crosses dulled by grime. They carried their entire art upon their backs: morphine, bandages, plasma, splints. They were the fragile hinge between life and the 1,000 forms of death that the island offered. Every morning began with the whine of mortars, the concussion of naval guns, the smell of burning fuel. Men disappeared in seconds. The corpsmen moved toward the smoke rather than away from it, crawling through craters, whispering the prayers they did not remember learning. To their right and left, Marines fired into caves whose mouths breathed flame, and in the pause between explosions came the sound of weeping from the slopes, from the ruined hamlets, from the caves where Okinawan families had hidden too long. By now, the Americans understood that the civilians were not enemies, yet they were everywhere, tangled in the machinery of war. They emerged waving white cloths, half-starved, often carrying the wounded. The corpsmen were the first to meet them. Some offered chocolate from sea rations, others a canteen of water. But the main offering was medical: iodine and gauze, penicillin, clean hands. Each act took place under fire. When the front stabilized around Shuri, a strange equilibrium formed. The dead covered the hillsides, the living built order out of ruin. It was here that the first true field clinics arose, not formal hospitals, but spontaneous sanctuaries. Corpsmen and Navy doctors took over the remnants of Buddhist temples, schoolhouses, and farm sheds, transforming them into spaces of reprieve. They hung white sheets at the entrances, both as signals and as prayers. Within these makeshift wards, the air was thick with antiseptic and humanity. On stretchers lay Marines with shrapnel in their lungs, Japanese soldiers with shattered limbs, Okinawan children feverish from infection. The corpsmen worked in silence. There was no time for ideology. They cleaned wounds with salt water when supplies ran out, sterilized instruments in mess tins over open flames, improvised splints from rifle stocks. The sound of bombing never ceased, but in those rooms something like peace took shape. A fragile, medical ceasefire. Outside, the earth convulsed. The Shuri line broke under relentless assault. Villages disappeared into craters. The corpsmen could feel the front moving through their very walls. They learned to operate between barrages, to freeze when the sky screamed, to resume stitching when it was over. The Japanese defense withdrew south, taking the civilians with them, thousands fleeing through mud, carrying relics of a culture that would not survive the month. Among those civilians were mothers, their faces burned by sun and fear. They carried infants whose cries had turned hoarse from hunger. Some had not spoken in days. When they reached the clinics, they knelt wordlessly, mistaking the Red Cross for a divine symbol rather than a military one. The corpsmen knelt in return, unsure whether to salute or to comfort. What passed between them was older than language, a recognition that mercy could exist even here. The clinics became islands within the island. The war roared around them, but inside small miracles multiplied. Blood plasma revived men pronounced dead. A child with a shattered leg survived after weeks of careful nursing. And yet, every night the sky rained steel again. The corpsmen learned to sleep sitting up, their boots still on, their medical kits never closed. They learned to stop counting the dead. At the edge of one ruined village stood a banyan tree whose roots coiled over a cave. There, the corpsmen treated both American and Japanese wounded, separated only by a wall of sandbags. The smell of decay was constant, but above it lingered the faint aroma of burned incense, an old woman, somewhere in the dark, still tending the memory of her ancestors. It was said that she never left, even when the shells came closer. The corpsmen never saw her face, but they found offerings near the entrance, rice bowls, wilted flowers, sometimes the bones of fish wrapped in leaves. They left her water in return. By mid-May, the battle had consumed nearly everything. The Navy's hospital ships overflowed, the wounded were ferried out in waves. On the beaches, stretchers formed long, silent processions. Corpsmen worked until their hands blistered, their nerves numbed. And still more came children, soldiers, the elderly carried on makeshift litters. The clinics expanded outward, tents spreading like white petals across the wrecked fields. In those tents, time lost its meaning. There was only the next wound, the next heartbeat. When the first typhoon swept over the island, it seemed almost merciful. The wind drowned the artillery for a night. Rain washed the blood from the paths leading to the clinics. In that temporary silence, some corpsmen looked around and realized what they had built, a place where enemies were equal beneath the bandages, where compassion was the only surviving law. But dawn brought the guns again. The storm was not over. It had only changed its name. The rains thickened until the island itself seemed to dissolve. Every ridge was a cataract, every trench a channel of clay. The once green hills of Okinawa now resembled the exposed organs of the earth. It was in this drowning landscape that the final defense of Shuri broke apart. From the north, columns of American armor pressed forward, their treads sinking into the mire. From the south, the last Japanese regiments fought from caverns whose entrances steamed like open wounds. Between them moved the civilians, an unnumbered procession of mothers, children, and the half-dead drifting toward the rumor of aid. By early June, the line was no longer a line at all. It was a shifting frontier of ruin. The corpsmen advanced behind bulldozers that cleared paths through wreckage, the sound of metal on bone muffled by rain. They carried litters through rivers that had once been roads. Plasma bottles swung from their shoulders like strange lanterns. When they reached the forward caves, the air was unbreathable cordite, decay, sweat, and the faint sweetness of rot. They treated whoever crawled out, regardless of uniform. Some Japanese soldiers came staggering with hands raised, others unconscious, their bandages black with mildew. For many, surrender arrived as a kind of medical condition. The fall of Shuri Castle was not an event, but a slow erosion. The limestone walls crumbled under continuous bombardment, revealing chambers filled with maps, corpses, and prayer scrolls plastered to the ceiling by humidity. When the corpsmen entered, they stepped through centuries. Rain pooled on the tatami floors, cherry blossom murals peeled like burned skin. Beneath the rubble, they found civilians who had taken refuge among the garrison women clutching children, old men still bowing even as their breath failed. The corpsmen moved among them quietly, the cross on their helmets dulled by soot, their hands steady despite the tremor of exhaustion. Outside, the first organized Navy relief teams began to arrive. They came ashore with crates of plasma, sulfa, penicillin modern alchemy against ancient suffering. With them came tents stamped U.S. Naval Medical Service, collapsible operating tables, field generators, and the authority of procedure. But the procedures dissolved the moment they met the island. There were too many wounded, too few translators, too little light. The corpsmen, already half feral from weeks in the mud, guided the newcomers through what was left of the villages. They pointed out which caves still hid survivors, which wells were poisoned, which paths vanished under shell fire. The clinics multiplied. One rose beside the ruins of Shuri Castle, another in the valley of Mabuni, a third along the Naha road where the corpses of oxen lay bloating in the sun. The Navy surgeons operated under canvas, the rain drumming overhead like relentless applause. They worked 16, 20 hours at a time. The corpsmen handled triage, marking those who could be saved, those who could not, and those whose wounds would wait. They learned to read the color of blood as others read weather. Bright arterial meant urgency, dark venous meant patience, gray pallor meant farewell. For the Okinawan civilians, the clinics became both refuge and revelation. Many had never seen electric light. Now they watched surgical lamps bloom in the darkness. They saw needles deliver clear fluids that pulled men back from death, saw instruments glint with impossible cleanliness. Mothers knelt at the edges of the tents, their eyes following every movement. Some wept silently, not from grief, but from the shock of witnessing gentleness amid annihilation. To them, the corpsmen were neither conquerors nor saviors, only a sudden proof that compassion could survive the ruin of nations. Yet the compassion was costly. Disease stalked the camp's dysentery, malaria, trench foot. The corpsmen's own bodies became experiments in endurance. Their skin bloomed with sores, their uniforms never dried. Letters home spoke of the smell of Okinawa as something that entered the lungs and would not leave. The smell was rot and disinfectant, wet limestone and phenol, the odor of mortality itself rendered ordinary. When the Japanese High Command ordered the retreat to the southern tip of the island, the clinics followed the refugees. They packed the wounded onto trucks, mules, sometimes their own backs, moving through landscapes that no longer had names. The horizon burned nightly. Thunder mixed with shell bursts until the two were indistinguishable. The corpsmen stopped counting days. The only measure of time was the rhythm of casualties arriving, morning, noon, dusk, endless. By the third week of June, organized resistance collapsed. Shuri fell entirely to silence. What remained were pockets of survivors hiding among the dead. The corpsmen entered these hollows with flashlights and stretchers, calling softly, their voices echoing off stone. Some caves answered with gunfire, others with the thin crying of children. In one such place near Mabuni Ridge, they found dozens of women who had poisoned themselves beside their infants, believing the Americans would bring torture. The corpsmen removed the surviving babies first. They did not understand the songs the dying mothers murmured, but the sound would haunt them longer than the explosions ever had. The Navy clinics filled beyond reason. Rows of cots extended into the open, men and women lying beneath rain ponchos. When supplies dwindled, the corpsmen sterilized needles over candles, tore bandages into quarters, used parachute silk as dressing. Improvisation became a creed. At night, the surgeons wrote reports by flashlight, noting cases not for statistics, but to remember that each number had once breathed. And then, suddenly, the guns ceased. The final Japanese stronghold on the island was extinguished. The hills no longer glowed at night. The silence felt alien, heavier than bombardment. The corpsmen looked around and saw the magnitude of what remained. Entire valleys turned to cemeteries, the air thick with mosquitoes and smoke. The clinics stood like white ghosts against the blackened soil. They were monuments not to victory, but to survival. In that silence, the mothers came again, hundreds of them, emerging from the caves with faces pale from months without light. They carried infants wrapped in cloth, children feverish and thin. When they reached the clinics, they knelt before the corpsmen, who could find no gesture adequate to the moment. The women bowed until their foreheads touched the mud, and the corpsmen, unsure what to do, bent down as well, their hands outstretched not in command but in apology. The chronicles would later record that Japanese mothers wept when Navy corpsmen opened field clinics on Okinawa. But the truth was quieter. They wept not because help had arrived, but because it had come too late for so many. Their tears were the final rain of the season, mingling with the mud that already held their dead. The island had gone still. After the guns, after the rain, after the last cries from the hills, Okinawa lay beneath a ceiling of pale summer clouds, the air heavy with the odor of wet limestone and unburied bodies. The war had ended here before it ended anywhere else. The battle was over, yet no one could name what remained. The land was wounded beyond metaphor. Paddies cratered into ponds, roads erased by tank treads, the bones of oxen bleaching beside collapsed tombs. Even the wind moved differently, uncertain which way to blow. For the Navy corpsmen, the transition from combat to occupation did not mean rest. It meant paperwork, triage, and the endless administration of mercy. The field clinics became the nucleus of a new order. Where once they had been temporary shelters, they now transformed into semi-permanent hospitals under canvas, spreading along the southern plain like a constellation of white stars. Sailors erected Quonset huts and strung electric wire through the ruins. Generators coughed, lights flickered to life, and the hum of civilization returned in fragile measure. Civilians came from every direction. They came limping, crawling, carried on makeshift stretchers woven from reed mats. They brought the wounded, the sick, and the dying. They brought the living who had forgotten how to speak. The corpsmen received them in silence, one after another, like priests at a ceaseless liturgy. They cleaned wounds, delivered infants, treated malaria, lanced abscesses, and buried the dead. The clinics became multilingual by necessity. English, broken Japanese, Okinawan dialects, gestures, the language of water and bandage. By July, the Navy had mapped the island into zones of care. Each zone was anchored by a central medical station with satellite aid posts radiating outward. Helicopters were still a fantasy of engineers. Everything moved by jeep, mule, or foot. Plasma was precious, morphine more so. The corpsmen rationed both with the discretion of philosophers. They had learned during the battle that compassion required discipline. One could not save everyone, but one could refuse to abandon the attempt. The weather turned tropical, bringing a new plague flies, fever, and the rot of uncollected remains. Navy doctors sprayed DDT in clouds so thick that the air itself seemed anesthetized. Civilians watched, bewildered, as the chemical snow settled upon the graves of ancestors. Some believed it was a cleansing ritual. Others feared it was another weapon. The corpsmen explained with gestures that it was medicine for the island itself, though few believed them. Amid the daily labor of saving lives, a quieter transformation unfolded. The Okinawan mothers who had once wept at the sight of the Red Cross began to participate. They swept the clinics, boiled water, learned the rudiments of sanitation. Corpsmen taught them how to dress wounds, to mix antiseptic, to recognize infection. In the act of teaching, the Americans discovered something unexpected. The women absorbed the knowledge with reverence, as if learning a new form of prayer. Within weeks, they became indispensable, the first nurses of the new Okinawa. Children wandered through the camp, small shadows of what had been lost. The corpsmen gave them crayons from supply boxes, taught them to write their names in Roman letters. Some drew pictures of ships and airplanes, others of mountains and flowers. When the drawings were hung on the clinic walls, the tents seemed to breathe. Life, tentative but undeniable, had returned, yet beneath the surface of reconstruction lay a current of grief too vast for ceremony. Every evening, as the heat fell and the lamps glowed, the mothers gathered at the perimeter of the camp. They faced the direction of the sea and sang ancient lullabies. The corpsmen did not understand the words, but they felt their meaning. The music of farewell turned into endurance. Many of the women had lost husbands, sons, or entire families. Their tears were not loud. They came like the slow leak of groundwater, persistent, unstoppable. Reports from higher command spoke of progress. They listed the number of civilians treated, the tons of supplies distributed, the cases of dysentery reduced. But those numbers could not capture the texture of the days, the smell of disinfectant mixing with incense, the sight of children sleeping beside the wounded, the way the sea shimmered indifferent beyond the barbed wire. The island was becoming a laboratory for a new kind of humanity, one built on the ruins of the old. The corpsmen themselves changed. Many no longer recognized their reflection in the polished lids of surgical instruments. Their faces had thinned, their eyes hollowed by months of seeing too much. Some had begun to keep small journals, not of strategy or medicine, but of moments. A child's hand gripping a finger, a mother's nod after her baby began to breathe again, the silence that followed the final heartbeat of a man they had tried too long to save. These entries, written in pencil on damp paper, would one day become the only record of the emotional geography of Okinawa. As July advanced, the typhoon season returned. Winds tore at the tents. Rain invaded the wards. Yet the clinics held. They had become more than structures. They were symbols of stubborn endurance. When the storms passed, the Americans and Okinawans emerged together to rebuild what had blown away. The cooperation was wordless but profound, a choreography of mutual necessity. It was around this time that the phrase began to circulate among the officers, "The island of tears has become the island of healing." It was not entirely true, but it was close enough to comfort them. For every life saved, 10 had already been lost, but saving one was enough to justify staying. One afternoon, near the edge of the southern cliffs, a corpsman discovered a small shrine that had survived untouched. Inside, beneath layers of soot, the stone figure of a goddess remained intact, her hands outstretched, her face calm. He cleaned the statue with a rag and placed a medical bandage around its base, as if to bind the wound of history itself. When the Okinawan women saw this, they left offerings of flowers and food beside it. The shrine became a shared altar, neither American nor Japanese, only human. As July faded into August, word spread through the camps that something immense had happened on the mainland cities destroyed by a single bomb, Japan on the edge of surrender. The corpsmen listened without celebration. They had seen what victory looked like, and it resembled nothing that could be cheered. Around them, the island still bled through its soil. They continued their rounds, changing dressings, delivering medicine, recording temperatures. The work was endless, and therefore sacred. When the formal surrender came in early September, Okinawa did not erupt in joy. It sighed. The mothers continued to sing at dusk, the children continued to draw, the clinics continued to glow against the darkness. The war was over everywhere but inside them. The corpsmen understood this, and in that understanding lay the beginning of peace. When autumn came to Okinawa, the island exhaled. The typhoons withdrew to the east, leaving behind skies so clear they seemed fragile, as if one more breath of wind might shatter them. Grass returned to the slopes, thin at first, then in sudden bursts of green that hid the scars beneath. The air smelled of salt and smoke, of slow healing. The sound of engines faded, replaced by the murmur of waves that had not been heard in months. The Navy clinics remained, half medical outposts, half monuments, their canvas roofs bleached pale under the sun, their white paint flaking into the soil. The corpsmen continued to treat the sick, though the wounds had changed. There were fewer bullet holes now, more infections, malnutrition, childbirths. The island was learning to live again, and the corpsmen found themselves midwives of that rebirth. They no longer thought of themselves as soldiers. Their rifles hung unused. Their bandages were their weapons now. The war had stripped them of certainty, but left them something quieter, a discipline of care that no uniform could contain. When they looked at the Okinawan children playing among the tents, they saw not victory, but inheritance. The fragile continuity of life after catastrophe. The mothers who had once come weeping now came smiling, shyly at first, then with open gratitude. They brought vegetables from reclaimed fields, seaweed from the shore, handmade dolls stitched from salvaged cloth. They bowed, the corpsmen bowed in return, and the exchange became a daily ritual. Each offering was an act of translation, between languages, between wounds, between the living and the dead. Some of the corpsmen left in late 1945, replaced by newer units of occupation forces. They departed quietly, their duffel bags heavy with letters, their faces turned toward the horizon they had first crossed as invaders. Before leaving, many visited the shrine near Mabuni, where the bandaged goddess stood amid flowers. They left tokens of their own, a scalpel, a pair of forceps, a folded Red Cross armband. The shrine absorbed these offerings without judgment. It had seen enough to understand that remembrance itself was a form of medicine. For those who remained, the work continued. They assisted in rebuilding schools, vaccinating children, purifying wells. They trained local apprentices who would one day become Okinawa's own nurses and doctors. Each gesture, however small, carried the weight of redemption. The corpsmen did not speak of the battle any more. They carried it inside them, a silent anatomy of memory. At night, when the generators stuttered and the lamps dimmed, the island glowed faintly with phosphorescence from the sea. The corpsmen would stand at the shoreline, listening to the waves erasing their footprints, and think of all that had been lost. They remembered the caves, the cries, the smell of disinfectant mixing with blood, the first time a mother had trusted them enough to place a child in their arms. They understood that history would remember the battle as a victory, but in their hearts it remained a requiem. Years later, when Okinawa was rebuilt and the clinics replaced by hospitals of steel and glass, old villagers would still tell the story. How, in the summer of 1945, the Americans came with medicine instead of bullets. How the white tents glowed like lanterns in the storm. How Japanese mothers had wept, not from fear, but from the shock of mercy. The tale would shift in its retelling, polished by memory into something larger than fact. Yet at its core remained the truth that compassion had survived the greatest cruelty humanity could devise. Some of the corpsmen returned decades later, gray-haired now, invited to ceremonies of reconciliation. They stood before monuments inscribed with names in 2 languages, unsure where to place their hands. The Okinawan nurses who greeted them were the daughters of the women they had once treated. They bowed deeply, and in that gesture the circle closed. The island, once the site of apocalypse, had become a bridge. The sea that had carried the ships of invasion now carried fishing boats again. Children played on the beaches where stretchers had once lain in rows. The banyan trees regrew their leaves, shading the graves below. From a distance no trace of war remained, but when the wind rose, it carried faint echoes, the thrum of engines, the whispers of mothers singing their lost lullabies, the heartbeat of the island itself remembering. At the site of the old field clinic near Shuri, a small memorial stands. It is simple, a bronze plaque and a carved stone basin filled with water. The inscription reads, in English and Japanese, "Here mercy met war." Visitors still pour water into the basin, letting it overflow, watching it trickle down the rock face into the soil. The locals call it the memory of water and light, for it mirrors the sky during the day and the candles placed beside it at night. When the wind passes over the basin, it ripples slightly, as if stirred by unseen hands. Those who pause to look may see, reflected in its surface, a faint image, a white tent, a cross, a pair of figures kneeling in the rain. One offering, one receiving, both trembling. It lasts only an instant before dissolving, like breath on glass. No official chronicle can capture that moment. It belongs not to history, but to the quiet continuum of human tenderness that outlives empires. The corpsmen who once walked the mud of Okinawa carried that knowledge home within them, an invisible medal that no ceremony could bestow. They had seen what war does and what compassion can undo, if only for a heartbeat. And so the story endures, of an island that wept, of mothers who bowed, of young men who learned that healing is another form of courage. The rain still falls on Okinawa, soft and persistent, washing over graves and gardens alike. It carries with it the memory of those days when the world was ending and beginning at once, when Japanese mothers wept and Navy corpsmen, kneeling in the mud, reached out their hands and answered with light.